The rifle shot came at 3:17 local time. One round, one trigger pull, and then silence so complete it felt like the desert itself had stopped breathing. 847 meters away, on a ridge that most men couldn't identify in daylight, a Taliban commander dropped mid-sentence. The men around him scattered. They didn't know where the shot came from. They didn't know the direction. They didn't know the shooter. Neither did the 12 American soldiers standing in the dark at FOB Kilo 7. Staff Sergeant Ray Kowalski keyed his radio. His voice was flat, almost bored. Threat neutralized. Lieutenant Daniel Rourke swept his binoculars across the northern ridgeline. Once, twice. He was looking for a muzzle flash, a heat signature, a silhouette, anything that would tell him which of his men had just made an impossible shot in the middle of the night from an unsanctioned position. He found nothing. Then PFC Owen Briggs touched his arm and pointed. Not at the ridge, not at the valley floor. He pointed at the space 6 feet to their left, where a specialist in a Signal Corps uniform was slowly lowering an M24 sniper rifle that didn't belong to her. She had borrowed it from a fallen soldier 3 minutes earlier without asking permission, without announcing intent, without saying a single word to anyone. Her hands were not shaking. She set the rifle down with the care that spoke to long familiarity. Then she straightened, adjusted the strap on her radio pack, and looked at Rourke with an expression that said absolutely nothing. Specialist Cole, Rourke said. Sir, that shot was 800 meters. 847, sir. Rourke stared at her for a long moment. Around them, 11 soldiers who had been laughing at this woman 3 days ago stood in the silence that follows, things men don't have words for yet. Kowalski was not looking at Rourke. He was looking at Sarah Cole. And something in his face, something old and quiet, and not entirely surprised, told anyone paying attention that he had been waiting for this moment since the day she arrived. 3 days earlier. The Kwan-3 touched down at Bagram at 1440 hours. The September heat came through the cargo ramp like a wall. It was 107 degrees and climbing the kind of heat that turned the air above the tarmac into something liquid and wrong. Sarah Cole stepped down the ramp with her duffel and her radio pack and her helmet, and she moved the way people move when they've learned early that being noticed is rarely useful. She was 5'3", 119 pounds. No combat patch on her right shoulder. No unit citations above her name tape. Just the basics, marksmanship. Physical fitness, the standard decorations the Army hands out to anyone who shows up consistently and doesn't break anything. Kowalski was watching from the edge of the tarmac when she arrived at FOB Kilo 7 the following morning via resupply helo. He had been watching the landing zone out of habit, the way men who've spent enough time downrange develop routines that have nothing to do with assigned duties. He watched the helo settle, watched the crew kick out the supply pallets, watched her step off last, adjust the weight of her pack, and then stand very still for approximately 4 seconds, scanning the compound. Not nervously, methodically. The way someone scans a space when they're building a picture of it. Kowalski filed that away and said nothing. Rourke ran the intake briefing the same way he ran everything efficiently and without sentimentality. Delta Platoon 3rd Battalion assembled in the shade of the vehicle bay. 14 soldiers who had been sharing this dusty postage stamp of a forward operating base for 63 days. They were lean and tired and competent in the way of men who have stopped pretending that war is anything other than what it is. New Body Rourke said the same way he would announce a new radio frequency or a change in patrol timing. Specialist Cole, Signal Corps. She handles radio traffic and comms maintenance. Questions. PFC Jake Delvane had a question. He always had a question. She shoot. Rourke's expression didn't change. She types Delvane. Delvane turned to the soldier beside him and said something that produced a low ripple of laughter through the formation. Sarah stood at ease and looked at the middle distance and gave no indication that she had heard it, which she had because she was standing 8 feet away, and the acoustics inside a vehicle bay are excellent. Kowalski did not laugh. He was looking at her hands. No fidgeting, no nervous energy. Her fingers rested against the side seams of her pants with the relaxed precision of someone who has spent a great deal of time learning to be still. After the briefing, Rourke showed her the comms room, a plywood box with a generator, 2 radio sets, a laptop bolted to a table, and ventilation that existed as a concept rather than a functional reality. He gave her the standard orientation speech patrol schedule, chow times, water discipline, what to do when the mortar started. Any questions, he said. No, sir. You've been downrange before. No, sir. Family military. She paused for exactly 1 second. My father was sir. Rourke waited for more. None came. He moved on. That night, Sarah Cole sat on her cot in the hooch. They had assigned her a single-room partition with a steel door that didn't quite close, and she opened a notebook. Not a standard issue field journal. This was older. The cover was worn smooth along the spine, the edges gone soft from years of handling. She opened it to the first page, then passed it, then passed a dozen more. The pages were covered in small, careful handwriting. Pencil in some places, ballpoint pen in others. Elevation tables. Wind conversion charts. Hand-drawn topographical sketches with notations in the margins. Range estimates and trajectory corrections. Patient, methodical, deeply knowledgeable work. In the lower right corner of the inside cover, written in permanent marker T, Cole SFC, 3rd, SFG 2008. She read for an hour. Then she closed the notebook, turned off her light, and lay in the dark listening to the desert wind move through the concertina wire on the perimeter wall with a sound like something breathing. The first morning, Delvain made a comment about her coffee cup. The second morning, he made a comment about her radio checks. On the third morning, as the platoon staged for a patrol into the Wadi Kunar system, he looked at her pack configuration, then at PFC Owen Briggs, and said loudly enough for half the formation to hear, "What do you think she's going to do if we make contact call for help?" Briggs, who was a decent human being, looked uncomfortable. "Cool it," he said quietly. "I'm just saying." Kowalski was standing 12 feet away checking his own kit. He didn't look up. He didn't say anything. He just kept checking his kit with the same calm efficiency he brought to every task. Sarah finished adjusting her radio harness and walked to her position in the formation. Rourke's patrol order was clean and professional. 7-man element standard wedge sweep, the Eastern Wadi system eyes on a series of grid squares that Intel had flagged for recent vehicle activity. Return to the fob by 1600. No engagement unless engaged. Rules of engagement in effect. "Move out," Rourke said. They moved out. The desert in September in Kunar province is not the flat, empty desert of movies. It is a complicated, broken landscape of dry riverbeds and rock formations and ridge lines that fold into one another in ways that defeat simple navigation. The mountains to the north carry permanent snow at altitude, which seems impossible given the heat on the valley floor, but is nonetheless true. The vegetation is sparse and full of places where people who want to remain unseen can remain unseen for a very long time. Thomas Cole had drawn this valley in his notebook, not from satellite imagery, from personal observation over many walks in every light condition. He had written notes about how shadow fell at different hours, how wind moved through the wadi channels, how the reflection off certain rock faces at certain times of day could be distinguished from the reflection off a scope lens if you knew what you were looking for. His daughter had read those notes until she had memorized them. She walked in the middle of the formation, maintaining interval, one hand on the radio handset, scanning her sectors. From the outside, she looked like every other soldier in a formation, present alert, doing the job. But she was also doing something else. She was reading the valley. 22 minutes into the patrol, they were moving along the southern wall of the main Wadi Channel heading northeast. The sun was at their backs, low enough to create long shadows, but high enough to create significant glare off the rock formations on the opposite ridge. Sarah studied the ridgeline. She studied the way the shadows lay across the upper face. She looked at a section approximately 310 meters out on a bearing of roughly 280 degrees, where a natural depression in the rock offered excellent concealment and an unobstructed view of the wadi floor. The shadow in that depression was wrong. Natural shadows in rock formations follow predictable geometry. They obey the angle of the sun and the contour of the surface. The shadow in this particular depression had a small, irregular component at its lower left edge that didn't follow the geometry. It was too dark in one spot, too consistent, too human. She moved up beside Kowalski. "Bearing 280, she said quietly. 310 meters. Upper depression in the ridge face. The shadow in the lower left corner doesn't match the sun angle." Kowalski didn't change his pace. Didn't look immediately. He kept walking for 3 more steps before he turned his head in that direction with the casual ease of a man checking the terrain out of habit. He looked for about 2 seconds. Then he looked at her. She had already moved back to her position. 17 minutes later, the shot came from bearing 280, approximately 300 meters from the upper depression in the ridge face. It hit Owen Briggs in the upper right thigh. The formation scattered to cover with the practiced speed of people who had drilled this moment until it was reflex rather than thought. Rourke's voice cut through the sudden noise. "Contact left upper ridge, 3 o'clock from axis." Soldiers went to the ground, weapons up. Return fire hit the ridge line. Briggs was down, rolling onto his back, hands pressing against the wound, with the involuntary urgency of a body trying to prevent itself from bleeding out. The blood was dark and immediate, and there was a great deal of it. Sarah was moving before anyone gave an order. She reached him in 6 seconds, sliding in behind a rock that offered partial cover. She had the tourniquet off her kit and on his thigh in 68 seconds, tightening it past the wound, his face going from gray to something closer to white while she worked. She kept her body between him and the ridge line. She worked with both hands, checking placement, speaking to him in a flat, steady voice. Look at me. Stay with me. This is going to hold. Stay with me. Briggs gritted his teeth and looked at her and did not look away. Rourke was directing fire from 20 feet to her left. He glanced over once and watched her finish the tourniquet and begin a secondary check for other wounds. He watched her work for approximately 5 seconds. Then he turned back to the engagement. That was the first time. The firefight lasted 11 minutes. The shooter on the ridge did not fire again after the initial contact. The return fire from the patrol had forced a displacement. The all-clear came from Kowalski, who had moved to a flanking position during the engagement with a silence that seemed almost impossible for a man his size. They extracted Briggs on a stretcher, improvised from 2 rifles and a jacket. He was conscious and stable and furious about being carried. Sarah walked beside him, monitoring his color, checking the tourniquet twice on the return route. Delvain was quiet the entire way back. At FOB Kilo 7, after the medevac had come and gone and the debrief had been logged, Rourke stood in the comms room doorway and looked at Sarah Cole for a long moment. She was running radio checks on the frequencies they had used during the patrol, verifying signal integrity, logging the results with the methodical attention she brought to every administrative task. Specialist. She looked up. Sir, that tourniquet application, that wasn't Signal Corps training. Combat Lifesaver course, sir. I attended it as an elective. In 68 seconds. The standard is 90, sir. He was quiet for a moment, then, the shot you called on the ridge, bearing 280. Sir, you want to tell me how you made that read? Sarah set down her pen. She thought about it for a second with the look of someone choosing their words carefully, not because they were trying to hide something, but because they were trying to be accurate. Shadow analysis, sir. The sun angle at that time of day creates predictable shadow geometry across that ridge face. There was an anomalous dark patch in the lower left section of the upper depression that was too consistent to be natural. Could have been a water stain. Could have been rock mineral variation. She paused. Wasn't. Rourke looked at her for another moment. Then he walked away without another word. He didn't need to say anything else. She had watched his face. That was enough. That night, the compound settled into the quiet that follows a day of contact, not peaceful, but exhausted. The generators hummed. The perimeter guards rotated in their usual rhythm. The desert outside the walls went dark under a sky so clear and full of stars it seemed like a different universe from the one that had just spent 11 minutes trying to kill them. Sarah was sitting outside her hooch on an ammunition crate, writing in her father's notebook. Not in the pages he had filled, those she treated with the care of someone who understood that certain things cannot be replaced, but in the blank pages at the back that he had left empty, as though he knew someone would need them. Kowalski walked over with 2 cups of coffee that were technically coffee in the same way the FOB was technically a military installation. The label was accurate if you didn't ask too many questions. He handed her one without asking if she wanted it. She took it. He sat on another crate, not close enough to be intrusive, and drank his coffee and looked at the compound wall. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have independently concluded that most things are better understood through observation than conversation. After a while, Kowalski said, "That's Tom's notebook." It was not a question. Sarah looked at him. In the low light from the distant generator lamps, his face was all sharp planes and deep shadows, a face that had been outdoors in difficult places for a very long time. He was looking at the notebook in her hands with recognition. Not the polite kind, the real kind. "You knew him," she said. "Cunard Danyam, 2008 to 2009. He took a slow drink of his coffee. He was attached to our element for a 3-month rotation. Tom Cole. A small pause. Best natural reader of terrain I ever worked with. Better than anyone I've seen since. He looked at her. Except maybe this afternoon on the Wadi. Sarah was quiet. He taught you, Kowalski said. From the time I was 8 years old. She ran her thumb along the edge of the notebook. Every weekend I wasn't in school, every summer. He had a range on a friend's property in western Montana. 1,000 acres. He built observation hides and I had to find them. He set up targets at distances he didn't tell me, and I had to calculate them from first principles. She paused. He didn't go easy on me because I was his daughter. He went harder. Kowalski nodded once. He stopped when I was 21, Sir said. About 8 months before he deployed for the last time. Her voice was steady and flat and completely controlled in the way of someone who has spent 3 years learning how to talk about something without letting it take them apart. He sat me down and told me he was going to say something important. He said, "I've taught you to do something that most people can't do, and I need you to promise me you won't use it to take a life." She looked at her coffee. He said, "Once you start, the world changes. You can't unlearn what it feels like, and I don't want that for you." Kowalski was still. "So I promise," Sarah said, and then 4 months later he was gone, and I enlisted because I didn't know what else to do with myself. And I put in for Signal Corps because it felt like the furthest I could get from what he'd taught me while still being close to the only world I'd ever understood. The generator hummed. Somewhere on the perimeter, a guard called a quiet all clear. "He wasn't wrong," Kowalski said. "No," Sarah agreed. "He wasn't." She closed the notebook. She did not elaborate on the tension between her father's words and the reality of being a trained marksman in a forward operating base in Kunar province. She didn't need to. Kowalski had spent enough time in enough difficult places to understand that some things don't resolve cleanly, and the honest response to that is silence rather than comfort. They finished their coffee. He stood to leave, then he paused. "He talked about you," Kowalski said, "on the rotation. He didn't talk about much, but he talked about you. He said, a brief pause, the kind a man takes when deciding how much truth is useful. He said if anything ever happened to him, he hoped you'd find a way to be in the field, that you had the eyes for it." His words. He walked away before she could respond. Sarah sat with that for a long time in the dark. The fourth day, Rourke ran the morning briefing with a new element on the map, a section of the Eastern Ridge System 2 kilometers north of the main wadi. Intelligence had flagged vehicle tracks in the last satellite pass. 2 sets, heavy tread, recent, moving along a line that put them parallel to their patrol route from the previous day. "It could be civilian supply traffic," Rourke said. "It could be something else. We're going to glass the ridge from the elevated position on the south bank before we commit to any further patrol in that sector." He looked at his soldiers. "Anyone have anything relevant from yesterday's contact that didn't make it into the formal debrief?" Silence. Then Kowalski said, without looking up from his map, "Cole called the shooter's position 20 minutes before contact." The room shifted, not dramatically, but in the way of a room where everyone suddenly needs to recalibrate something. Rourke looked at Sarah. "The shadow read," he said. "Yes, sir." Delvin was looking at the table. His jaw was working the way it works when a man is revising an opinion he held loudly and publicly. "You've done this before," Rourke said. "Read terrain like that." Sarah's answer was careful and true. "I've had training, sir." "What kind of training?" The pause was short, informal. Rourke looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man filing information under categories that would need to be revisited. Then he returned to the map. "Cole," he paused. "You're on radio and terrain observation. Flag anything that looks inconsistent." "Yes, sir." Delvin raised his eyes from the table briefly. He looked at Sarah, then away, then at the middle distance where men look when they are processing things they are not ready to say out loud. Kowalski noticed. He said nothing. The glassing operation ran from 0800 to 1100. 7 soldiers on the elevated south bank, spread across 400 meters of ridgeline, eyes on the northern terrain through optics of varying power. The desert baked. The wind moved in from the northwest at approximately 12 knots, shifting occasionally to gusting. At 0937, Sarah was 90 meters from Rourke's position, kneeling behind a rock shelf with her binoculars up, working a slow, systematic scan of the northern ridge. She had done this for 97 minutes with almost no movement and no noise, which was by itself remarkable enough that Kowalski, 30 meters to her right, had spent a portion of those 97 minutes watching her rather than the ridge. She stopped her scan, went back 400 meters, stopped again. She keyed her radio quietly. "Lieutenant?" Rourke's voice, "Go ahead." "Northern Ridge, grid K4271-8840. There's a vehicle trail that wasn't on our imagery, fresh, running northeast along the base of the second ridgeline behind the primary visible terrain." She paused. "It's hidden from aerial observation by the rock overhang. You can only see it from this elevation at this sun angle." A 10-second silence. "Copy. Glass it and report." She glassed it for another 4 minutes. "Tracks are deeper going in than coming out. Something went in loaded and came out light or hasn't come out yet. There's a natural depression at the northeast terminus that's been improved. The lip of the depression has been reinforced. The rock surface on the upper edge is lighter than the surrounding material. Fresh disturbance. Someone's been building up that position." "What do you mean improved?" Rourke said. "Worked stone on the upper edge, not natural fall. Someone reinforced it by hand." Rourke's voice had a different quality when he came back. "Kowalski, Glass NK4271-8840. Tell me what you see. Kowalski took 2 minutes. She's right. Improved position. Light material on the upper edge. That's work stone. Rourke called the patrol back. They walked back to the FOB in silence that was different from the previous day's silence. The previous day had been shock. This was soldiers recalibrating the picture they had of a person who turned out to be something different from what they had assumed. Delvain walked the entire 2 kilometers without speaking, which had not happened since he arrived. Back inside the wire as they dropped their kits in the vehicle bay, Delvain walked past Sarah. He slowed. He looked at her. He opened his mouth, closed it, walked on. Kowalski, who had seen this from across the bay, allowed himself an expression that contained something between recognition and something older. The look of a man who has seen this exact moment before and knows how it ends. Sarah set her kit down and went to the comms room and ran her scheduled radio checks. Whatever she felt about the day, she kept it in the place where she kept everything behind a face that gave nothing away, in the company of a dead man's notebook and a living man's voice in her memory that said, when she had asked him once why he was so patient when he taught her, because the shot isn't the hard part. Being ready for it is. The shot takes 1 second. Being ready takes years. Most people want the second. You have to earn the years. That night, for the second time, Kowalski brought coffee. They sat in the same configuration, the same distance, the same quiet. The desert was cold now. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees since midday, the way it does in the high desert without warning. As though the heat of the day was a lie, the land told, and the cold of the night was the truth. He was right about the eyes, Kowalski said. Sarah turned her coffee cup in her hands. The improved position you spotted today, he said. From that distance, at that angle through field glasses, most people wouldn't see that in a week of staring. You got it in 90 minutes, he paused. That's Tom's training and Tom's eyes, but those were always yours. Sarah looked at the sky. The stars were out again. The Milky Way was visible as a solid band, the kind of sky you only see in places with no electricity for 100 miles in any direction. I'm aware that keeping that promise is going to get harder, she said. Kowalski said nothing. I'm aware that there's probably a moment coming where it's going to cost something I don't want to pay. She paused. I'm just not ready to let go of it yet. No, Kowalski said. He asked me for one thing. I know. She turned and looked at him. In the dark, the distance between them felt both specific and very old. The distance between people who have to make impossible decisions and people who understand that the decisions are impossible and don't try to make them easier by pretending otherwise. He would have understood, Kowalski said. Whatever you decide, he would have understood. Sarah looked back at the sky. She did not answer. And Kowalski, who had served with Thomas Cole for 3 months in this same valley, in this same desert, under this same sky, and who had never once heard the man ask for something he wasn't prepared to pay for himself, sat with her in the cold and the quiet and did not press. The promise was still intact. For now, it was intact. 3 days later, at 3:17 local time, it would not be. And the world, as Thomas Cole had told his daughter, it would change. In the 90 seconds before she picked up the rifle, Sarah Cole stood in the gap in the western berm and did not move. The desert at 3 o'clock was 38 degrees and dropping. She could see the commander on the ridge through the M24 scope, a borrowed rifle, a weapon she had never asked for and was holding now with hands that knew exactly what to do with it, even as every other part of her argued otherwise. Her father's voice did not come to her as a warning. It came the way it always came when she needed it most, as a question, not did you promise me? She had, not do you remember what I said? She did. The question was the one he had never asked because he had already answered it himself in 18 years of teaching her in the care he had taken to make her capable of exactly this moment. The question was, what is the promise actually for? She knew the answer. The commander had been on the radio for 4 minutes. The call coordinates pointed to their patrol route at 0600. Whatever he was directing was going to hit them on that route. Briggs was in the aid station with a tube in his arm. Kowalski was somewhere on the northern perimeter. Rourke had 14 soldiers who were going to step into that wadi in 3 hours without knowing what was waiting. The promise was for her. It was to protect her from what her father knew this would cost. It was not a rule about other people's lives. She understood that now in the cold, with the scope steady and the wind reading correctly, in every calculation already run. 4 counts in. Hold 7. 8 out. The world changed. The silence after the shot lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Rourke spoke. Specialist Cole. His voice was careful in the way that voices get careful when a man is controlling something larger than ordinary surprise. That was an unauthorized discharge from an unsecured weapon at an unconfirmed target. The target was confirmed, sir. By whom? By me. Rourke stared at her. 12 soldiers were watching this exchange with the focused attention of men who understood that something significant was being negotiated in front of them, even if none of them could yet name what it was. Walk me through it, Rourke said. Sarah set the M24 down carefully, barrel pointed at the ground the way someone sets down a tool when they're finished with it and intend to account for its use. I was running a perimeter check on the northern comms relay at 0300. The radio at position 4 has been dropping signal in the hour before dawn thermal differential affecting the connector housing. I've been running the check manually every morning for the past 2 days. She paused. While I was at position 4, I had line of sight to the northern ridge through the gap in the western berm. I saw the commander through the scope of Sergeant Halverson's rifle, which was at that position unsecured after his shift ended. Halverson, a staff sergeant from Alabama, who had been on perimeter duty until 0245, looked at the ground. He was on a radio handset, Sarah continued. The call had been running for approximately 4 minutes. I can't tell you the content because I don't speak the dialect. But the grid coordinates he was speaking toward were the same grid coordinates as our patrol route for 0600 this morning. She looked at Rourke directly. He was directing something, and whatever he was directing was going to hit us on that route. Rourke said nothing for a long moment. You calculated that shot in your head, he said, in the dark, with a rifle you'd never fired, at 847 meters. My father built a range in western Montana, sir. He set targets at distances he didn't tell me in advance. 847 is not the longest I've taken. Another silence, longer this time. Then Kowalski, who had been standing at the edge of this exchange without moving or speaking, said quietly, Sir, the 0600 patrol. Rourke looked at him. If she's right about the grid coordinates, Kowalski said, we should pull the patrol and reroute. Rourke looked at Sarah one more time. She returned his gaze with the same flat steadiness she had shown since the moment she arrived. Not defiant, not apologetic, simply present and certain in the way of someone who has already calculated the variables and is waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. Pull the 0600 patrol, Rourke said. Reroute via the southern channel. Brief at 0530. He picked up the M24 and handed it to Halverson. Secure your weapon, Sergeant. He walked away. She did not tell them that she had stood in the gap in the western berm for 90 seconds before she picked up the rifle, arguing with herself. She did not tell them what her father's voice had sounded like in her head during those 90 seconds, or what she had understood in the final moment before the trigger pull. The changed world was hers to carry, not theirs. She ran her signal checks with complete precision and logged the results in the correct format and let none of what she was carrying show on the surface of anything she did. The mortars started on the 6th night, 3 tubes. That was the first thing Sarah registered when the initial rounds came in at 22:17 hours, the distinctive cadence of 3 separate firing signatures staggered in a pattern that took her approximately 40 seconds to identify. Not random, not probe fire, a sequence. She was already in the comms room when Rourke came through the door with his kit half on, running the way men run when their body is ahead of their conscious thought. Get TOC on the line, he said. Contact report incoming indirect fire 3 tubes bearing. North, northeast, and northwest, Sarah said. She was already on the radio. Staggered firing sequence, 12-second interval walking pattern. Sir, this is sequential fire suppression. Rourke stopped. Say again. Sequential fire suppression. The pattern tube, 1 opens tube 3, answers on a diagonal tube, 2 fills the center gap 12 seconds later. It's designed to prevent defenders from identifying the primary threat axis while maintaining continuous pressure. She was watching the clock on the radio console as she spoke, counting intervals. FM 7 to 8, sir. Chapter 4, Indirect Fire Integration. That's a United States Army field manual. Rourke stared at her. Outside, another round came in and hit the eastern perimeter wall. The concussion wave moved through the plywood structure and rattled everything on the shelves. Someone trained them on our doctrine, sir said. This pattern isn't something you develop in the field. It requires formal instruction and enough repetition to execute under pressure with 3 separate crews coordinating timing. She looked at him. Whoever is running this operation has had help from someone who knows our playbook. Rourke was already thinking. He was running the implications in real time and not liking where they were landing. Get me battalion, he said. She got him battalion. The call lasted 6 minutes. Sarah ran the comms and kept her face neutral and listened to both sides of the conversation with the careful attention she brought to every technical problem, which was the same attention she was currently bringing to the fact that Rourke's voice had developed a quality she had not heard in it before. Not fear, something colder than fear. The quality of a man discovering that the parameters of his situation are different from what he was briefed. When the call ended, Rourke set the handset down very carefully. He looked at the wall for a moment, then he looked at Sarah. FOB Kilo 7 is part of a theater-level intelligence collection operation, he said. His voice was even and precise and utterly without inflection. We are positioned to draw activity from a weapons financing network operating across the eastern provinces. Battalion's words, we are functioning as an observation platform. The operation requires us to remain in position to continue generating the pattern of behavior that the network is responding to. Sarah heard what he did not say before he said it. No reinforcements, she said. Not in the next 48 hours. They knew this was coming. That appears to be the case. Another round came in. Closer. The generator light flickered. Sarah turned back to the radio console and began the process of coordinating a contact report with the accuracy and efficiency she had been trained for, which was useful because it gave her hands something to do and her mind something to process that was not the weight of being told that the people above you decided your life was an acceptable variable in an equation you were never shown. She had known men who had not recovered from that discovery. She had known her father had made peace with it, or something like peace, over years of service. She had a theory now about why he had been so particular about what he wanted for her, not the skills which he gave freely, but what he had wanted to protect her from. The equation, the spreadsheet, the variable. She filed the contact report. Then she picked up her rifle. Sir, she said, I need to be on the perimeter. Rourke looked at her. You're supposed to be on comms. Delvain can run comms. He's been watching me do it for 6 days. She met his gaze. You're undermanned on the northern wall. The sequential pattern is designed to force consolidation to the east. Whatever they're planning to do, they're going to do it from the north. Rourke was quiet for 3 seconds. Go, he said. The northern wall at FOB Kilo 7 was 140 meters of HESCO barrier, reinforced with sandbags and topped with concertina wire that caught the light of the flares and turned it into something that looked like teeth. Kowalski was at the midpoint behind a firing position that gave him angles on both the northern approach and the left flank. Halverson was 20 meters to his right. 2 other soldiers, PFC Garrett and Specialist Wendell, held the far ends. Sarah moved into position beside Kowalski. He looked at her, looked at the rifle, nodded once. Pattern, he said. FM 7-8, Chapter 4. Kowalski's jaw tightened. Someone's been talking. That's what I told Rourke. Another sequence of rounds came in the 3-tube pattern, walking across the compound in the geometry of a textbook exercise. She kept her eyes on the northern approach. They're going to probe the wire in the next 8 minutes, she said. How do you know? Because that's how Chapter 4 works. The suppression phase runs for approximately 15 minutes. Probe follows while defenders are still oriented toward the incoming fire. She was scanning the darkness beyond the wire through the rifle scope. The probe will come from the north while everyone is looking east. Kowalski raised his own optics without comment. The probe came in 7 minutes and 40 seconds. 6 fighters moving in 2-man bounds across the open ground north of the wire using the darkness and the noise of the ongoing mortar fire as cover. They were good. Professional spacing, good noise discipline, using dead ground effectively. If Sarah had not been looking for them, specifically in the place she had calculated, they would be the first indication of their presence, would have been the wire being cut. Contact north, she said into her radio. 6 personnel moving in bounds approximately 240 meters, bearing 360 from my position. Rourke's voice came back immediately. All elements orient north. Contact north. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. The fighters broke contact when Kowalski and Halverson opened up from the wall, losing 2 men in the withdrawal. They pulled back into the darkness, carrying their wounded. The mortar fire stopped 11 minutes later, with the abruptness of a faucet being turned off. In the silence that followed, Rourke walked the perimeter. He stopped at Sarah's position. Second time you've called it before it happened, he said. Yes, sir. The FM 7-8 pattern, you were certain. I've read it, sir. Another silence. The kind that accumulates around questions a man is deciding whether to ask. Then where does a signal corps specialist acquire the working knowledge to identify an indirect fire integration pattern under contact and call a probe timing to within 2 minutes? Sarah held his gaze. My father believed in thorough preparation, sir. Rourke looked at her for a long moment, recognizing a technically true answer to a question he was actually asking something else. He chose for the moment to let it stand. Get some rest, he said. We're going to have a hard day tomorrow. He walked away. Kowalski waited until Rourke was out of earshot. He's going to pull your file. I know, Sarah said. When he does, I know that too. She looked at the northern approach for a moment longer. Then she went to clean her rifle. The hard day came at 1400 hours the following afternoon. Not mortars this time, direct action. A coordinated assault from the south and west simultaneously, the kind of assault that required planning and rehearsal and significant logistics. Crew-served weapons, RPGs, a volume of fire that hit the southern wall and the vehicle bay and the guard towers within the first 90 seconds, with enough accuracy to suggest pre-planned targets rather than improvised aiming. They had been watched, they had been studied, and the study had been thorough. The fight was loud and close, and not going well for the first 11 minutes. Sarah was at the southern fighting position with Delvain and Kowalski when an RPG hit the barrier 20 meters to their left, and the blast wave came through the gap with enough force to pick her up and put her into the wall behind her at a velocity that drove the air from her lungs and painted white across her vision. She was conscious. The pain was immediate and specific, her left shoulder, her ribs on the same side, the back of her head where it had contacted the sandbags. Conscious, but not functional. The world had gone narrow and strange. She could hear the firefight continuing. She could hear Rourke on the radio. She could hear Delvain, and this was the thing that reached through the narrowness and brought her back. She could hear Delvain giving fire commands. Not panicking, not calling for help, giving fire commands. She forced herself upright, used the wall, found her rifle, got her eyes working. Delvain was at the southern barrier rifle up, moving in the pattern she had demonstrated to them 3 days ago, during what she had framed as a casual discussion of defensive positioning, the two-step lateral displacement before firing, the use of corner geometry to minimize exposure, the transition from the barrier top to the barrier gap based on incoming fire angle. He was doing it correctly. He was doing it with the automatic quality of someone who had practiced it or who had observed it practiced so many times that his body had absorbed it. Garrett was on his left, Wendell on his right, both moving in the same pattern. Kowalski was across the compound, visible through the smoke running suppression on the western approach. He saw Sarah come upright, and his eyes tracked to her in the 1-second check of a man verifying status alive, functional, continue, and then move back to his sector. She got to the barrier. Her shoulder was bleeding. She could feel it, and she could feel the heat that told her the source was more than superficial. She noted it as information rather than event. Information you factor in, not information you stop for. Delvain, she said. He glanced at her, assessed her shoulder in half a second. You're hit. I know. What's the western breach status? Kowalski's holding it. They pushed a team to the northwest corner 3 minutes ago, and Halverson cut them off. He fired twice, smooth, controlled. We've had 2 assault attempts at the southern gate. Both broke on the wire. Third one is going to be heavier. They've been watching the gap timing. She looked at the southern approach. He was right. The first 2 attempts had been probes testing response time, identifying the gap between the barrier positions, measuring the lateral coverage. The third would come through the center, using the coverage gap with enough weight to force the position before the defenders could consolidate. When they come, she said, let them get to the wire. Let them get to the wire. The closer they are, the less angle they have on us, and the more angle we have on them. The cover geometry reverses at 20 meters. She moved into her position on his left. When I say wire, you stand and fire. Not before. Delvain looked at her for 1 second with the look of a man committing something to memory. Wire, he said. They waited. The third assault came 4 minutes later. 12 fighters moving in a wedge, suppressing fire from their left flank, covering the approach. They came fast, and they came smart, and they came with the confidence of people who had studied this position from the outside and calculated that it was holding on a thread. They were right about the thread. They were wrong about the wire. Sarah let them come to 22 meters. Wire, she said. Delvain stood and fired. Garrett stood and fired. Wendell stood and fired. Sarah was already shooting, not at the assault element, but at the flanking position, covering their approach, 2 men with a PKM on the high ground to the southwest, who had been providing suppression and who Sarah had identified as the critical enable for the assault's timing. She put both of them down in 4 seconds. Without the flanking fire, the assault element's geometry collapsed. They were exposed close and suddenly without cover support. The next 40 seconds were very loud and very decisive. When it was over, Delvain was breathing hard and looking at the ground in front of the southern barrier with the expression of someone processing the distance between what almost happened and what actually happened. Sarah reloaded. Her shoulder was bleeding through her sleeve in a steady seep that had begun to compromise her grip. She noted it. You called the flankers, Delvain said. They were the enable. Kill the enable, the assault loses coordination. He looked at her. How long have you been doing this? She chambered around. Today is my first time, Delvain. She said it flatly without irony because it was technically true. And because the truth of it, this being the first time she had used what her father built in her for its intended purpose after 23 years, and one broken promise was something she was not prepared to unpack in the middle of a firefight with a man who had spent the last week reevaluating everything he thought he knew about her. Delvain looked at her for another moment. Then he turned back to his sector. The assault broke at 16:18 hours, not a tactical withdrawal or rout. They left 11 men on the ground between the wire and the southern berm and pulled the rest into the Wadi system to the south with the speed of people whose plan has not survived contact. Apache support arrived at 1641 and swept the Wadi system with thoroughness. In the quiet that followed, Sarah sat against the southern barrier with her back against the HESCO and let the medic work on her shoulder. The wound was a through and through from a fragment, not the RPG blast itself, but a secondary piece of the barrier cap. The medic called it manageable. Sarah asked him to tape it so she could use the arm. He taped it. Then before he moved on, he said, "Briggs is out of surgery." He said it the way medics deliver news when they're not sure if there's time for it to matter, cleanly without preamble. "He's going to walk again. Not today, but again." Sarah said nothing for a moment, then "Thank you." Kowalski came and sat beside her while the medic finished with the others. He did not say anything immediately. He had his own abrasions, a cut above his left eye, and the careful way he was sitting suggested rib involvement, but he had not gone to the medic and would not unless directly ordered to. "You held the southern position," he said. "Delvain held the southern position," she said. "I just helped with the geometry." Kowalski looked at the space where Delvain had been standing, with the look of a man who has seen a thing play out many times and finds, despite that familiarity, that it still means something. Then he looked at Sarah. "Rourke pulled your file while you were on the wall." Sarah was quiet. "He didn't say anything about it," Kowalski said, "but I saw his face when he put it down." She looked at the ground. "There isn't much left in it." No, there isn't. She had never seen the file herself. She knew what it contained. Her father had told her 2 weeks before he deployed for the last time. In the way he told her things he considered important, quietly, directly, without unnecessary preamble. He had told her that certain records from certain operations were maintained in ways that protected institutional interests more reliably than they protected the people involved. He had not been bitter about it. He had been specific. She had understood even then that he was telling her something about himself as much as about the system. "Kowalski," she said. He looked at her. "How did he die?" It was not a question. She had been asking it as a question for 3 years and getting the official answer which satisfied paperwork requirements without satisfying anything else. She was done asking it as a question. Kowalski was still for a long time. The sounds of the FOB settling back into its operational routines moved around them. Someone was running a generator. Someone was doing a casualty count. Rourke's voice was audible across the compound, calm and methodical, working through the post-contact procedure with the efficiency of a man who understands that what you do in the first hour after a fight determines whether the second hour goes better or worse. "Tom didn't die from enemy contact," Kowalski said. Sarah did not move. "The patrol he was on October 14th, 2009. It went into the northern Kunar on an interdiction mission. 3-element operation. Second element misread a grid coordinate under contact by 40 meters. Kowalski's voice was flat and factual and carrying something beneath the flatness that was not flatness at all. "The strike came in on the wrong position." Silence. "It happens," Kowalski said. "In the fog of contact at night with communications under pressure. It happens, and it is not the fault of the men who made the error because they were working in conditions that produce errors. And they were working in those conditions because someone above them made decisions about risk tolerance that those men were never asked to evaluate." He paused. "The men who called the strike carried it for years. Most of them still do." Sarah's hands were very still on her knees. "The investigation was opened," Kowalski continued. "Standard procedure, and then it was closed. And the closure documentation described the cause of death in language that was technically accurate and operationally vague. Enemy action was the official finding. The specific nature of the enemy action was classified." He looked at her. "Tom's record was clean. His men were protected. The story that went to the family was the story that protected everyone still living." "Who closed the investigation?" Sarah said. Kowalski was quiet for one more moment. "Colonel Victor Harrow," he said. "He was the theater operations officer. The investigation crossed his desk at the review stage, and he made the determination that the operational security implications of full disclosure outweighed the benefits." His words from the closure memo. He paused. "I obtained a copy through channels I will not describe. I've had it for 2 years." Sarah said nothing. "And Harrow is the officer who signed your deployment orders to FOB Kilo 7. Kowalski said. He knows who you are. He has known the entire time. The generator hummed. A flare went up on the eastern perimeter, someone running procedure out of habit. It lit the compound for 6 seconds in orange light and then faded. Sarah Cole sat with that information in the stillness of someone absorbing something they have been half expecting for a long time and are now confirming, which is different from surprise and carries a different weight. Surprise breaks things. Confirmation resolves them. In a cold and particular way, it resolves them. He sent me here to watch, she said. If I performed, he controlled the story. Daughter follows father into the field, distinguished service, clean legacy, everyone satisfied. If I failed or died cleaner still. She paused. Either way, he stays ahead of what I might eventually find out. That's my right, Kowalski said. He miscalculated. He didn't know what Tom had passed to you. The training, the preparation. Kowalski looked at her with the steady, weathered gaze of a man who has been waiting for a specific conversation and is now inside it. He knew Tom's daughter. He didn't know Tom's student. Sarah looked at the notebook she had carried through every patrol and every contact and every cold night in this compound. Her father's handwriting in the margins. His shadow on every page. We need to survive this, she said. Whatever comes next, whatever they send in the next 48 hours. We need to be here when the reinforcements arrive so that I am standing on American soil with witnesses and documentation and a story that cannot be closed by a single officer's administrative discretion. Kowalski said, then we survive. And then I tell the truth about what happened to my father. Yes, Kowalski said, then that. He stood slowly favoring his left side. He looked at the northern perimeter the way he looked at everything with the patient, thorough attention of someone who understood that the next threat would announce itself in exactly the way you stopped watching for. Get that shoulder dressed properly, he said, and eat something. Whatever's coming next, it won't wait for you to be ready. He walked toward the northern wall. Sarah opened her father's notebook to the back pages. Her pages, the ones she had been filling since she arrived. The patrol notes, the terrain sketches, the mortar pattern analysis with its FM7-8 notation in the margin. The calculations she had run in the dark before the 0317 shot. The world, as her father had told her, had changed. But it had not ended. She closed the notebook. She found food. She dressed her shoulder properly alone in the way he had taught her to treat a field wound when no one else was available. The 48-hour window was running. Whatever Victor Harrow had decided to accomplish by sending her here, he was going to have to accomplish it against a woman who now knew the exact shape of what he had done and who had 3 years of preparation and 6 days of proof that she was not the variable he had calculated for. The desert outside the walls was quiet in the way deserts go quiet before the thing that ends the quiet. Sarah Cole picked up her rifle. She was ready. The 48 hours did not last 48 hours. They lasted 19. At 1100 the following morning, while Rourke was running a damage assessment on the southern wall and Kowalski was supervising the repositioning of the remaining ammunition reserves, Sarah was in the comms room, running her standard frequency checks when the pattern changed. She heard it before she understood it. The radio traffic on the monitored frequencies, the ones she had been cataloging since her second day at FOB Kilo 7, building a picture of the communications architecture. The way her father had taught her to build a picture of terrain had been running at a consistent volume and rhythm for the past 6 days. She had learned its grammar. The check-in intervals, the relay nodes, the cadence of a network operating at maintenance level versus a network operating at activation level. At 1100 hours and 14 minutes, the traffic volume increased by a factor she had not seen before. Not a probe, not a test. A coordination sequence. She was at Rourke's position in 90 seconds. He heard her coming and turned before she reached him. They're coordinating final assault, she said. The radio traffic pattern shifted 11 minutes ago. Activation level, not maintenance. Multiple relay nodes answering simultaneously. That means multiple elements receiving the same instruction at the same time. She held his gaze. This is the last one. They're going to commit everything they have left. Timeline, he said. I don't know. The coordination sequence was still running when I left the room. Could be 2 hours, could be less. She paused. The traffic suggested multiple approach vectors. Not south this time. They know we've reinforced south. They're going to come from the north and west simultaneously and use the Wadi Channel to the east as an egress route so they don't have to fight their way out. They're planning to go through us. They're planning to go through us, film what they find, and be in the Wadi before any air support can box them in. Rourke was quiet for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time for a man who processed faster than most. It told Sarah that he was not calculating tactics. He was calculating something else. We have 16 effective soldiers, he said. 3 critical wounded in the aid station. One helipad that can support one bird at a time. Reinforcements in 29 hours. I know. Tell me what you need. Sarah had spent the previous night between the end of the last engagement and the beginning of first light writing in the back pages of her father's notebook. Not observations, plans, contingencies. The geometry of a defensive problem she had been working since the day she arrived and could now see whole because she now understood the objective she was defending against and the timeline she was working within and the exact nature of what would happen to the people around her if she got it wrong. She told him what she needed. He gave it to her. The soldiers of Delta Platoon assembled in the vehicle bay at 11:30. 16 functional soldiers moving with the resigned efficiency of people walking towards something unpleasant but necessary. Before the briefing, Delvain found her at the door. He spoke first. "Whatever you're about to ask," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "That's it," he said. "Just yes." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked to the front of the vehicle bay. The briefing was 8 minutes. She did not use emotional language. She did not make promises she could not quantify. She described the threat, the defensive geometry, the specific assignments, and the two things she needed every soldier to understand without exception. First, nobody consolidates without a direct order. The assault is going to look like it's winning in its first 5 minutes because that is what coordinated assaults look like. The response to that is not movement. The response is discipline. Second, when the order comes to move, you move immediately and you move to the position you have been assigned. Not toward the firefight, to the position. Trust the geometry. She looked at their faces when she finished. She was looking for the thing her father had taught her to look for, not enthusiasm, not fear, but the settled quality of people who have received clear information and have made their decision about it. Settled did not mean unafraid. Settled meant the fear had been incorporated rather than suppressed. She saw it. Kowalski, standing at the back of the bay, saw her see it. He said nothing. "Questions," she said. Delvain raised his hand. "When this is over, I'm buying the first round." The laughter was brief and genuine and cut off by its own internal timer, because these were people who understood that there was a significant operational distance between now and the moment when that round could be purchased. "Move to your positions," Sarah said. The assault began at 13:47, north and west simultaneously as she had called it. The north came first by approximately 40 seconds of feint, designed to pull the defensive weight in that direction before the western wall took the heavier commitment. It was a clean tactical concept, well executed. The fighters who came from the north were good and they were disciplined, and they hit the northern wire with enough weight to make it feel like the primary effort. Garrett held the northwest corner. Wendell held the eastern wall. Halverson held the comms relay. Delvain held the southern position and did not move north despite the volume of fire pulling every natural instinct in that direction. The western assault hit 3 minutes after the northern feint, heavier, faster, with RPG support that took out the western guard tower in its first 30 seconds and opened a gap in the Hesco line large enough for 2 men to move through side by side. The fighters poured into the gap with the momentum of people who have rehearsed this exact moment and know what comes next. What came next was not what they had rehearsed. Sarah was at the western position when the gap opened. She had been there for 11 minutes, having called the western wall as the primary effort based on the radio traffic pattern and the fact that the north feint had been too clean, too precisely timed to be a genuine assault. She had been in position before the western fighters cleared the outer wire. The first 4 fighters through the gap met the geometry she had built. Interlocking fields barrier positions that forced channeling a firing line that created a single fatal funnel from 3 angles simultaneously. The assault element's momentum, which was its primary advantage, became the mechanism of its own disruption. They came fast, and they came into a space that had been mathematically designed to receive them at that speed. She was shooting from the left position. Kowalski was on the right. Between them, 2 other soldiers held the center. It was loud and it was close, and it lasted 4 minutes before the assault element broke and fell back to the gap. They broke. They did not quit. The second wave was twice the size of the first, and this time they had a PKM crew, supporting the approach from elevated ground outside the western wall, a position Sarah had identified in the terrain analysis and had not been able to cover with the soldiers available to her. The PKM suppressed the left fighting position in the center, simultaneously pinning Kowalski and the 2 soldiers behind their cover. And in the 30 seconds of that suppression, the second wave moved through the gap and spread into the compound. Sarah had one angle on the PKM position. Once, it required her to expose herself from the left barrier to the elevated ground, accepting fire from the crew for the duration of the shot. She calculated the angle, the distance, the wind, the time required. Her shoulder was still bleeding. The tape was saturated, and her grip on the right side was compromised by approximately 15%. She noted it. She moved from the barrier. The PChem crew saw her, the gun tracked. The first burst hit the ground 4 feet to her right and walked toward her, and she was already firing 1 round for the gunner, 1 round for the assistant transition. 2 rounds at the approach vector to create a decision problem for the men coming through the gap. The PKM stopped. The blast hit her from her left side. It was not the PKM. It was an RPG from the northern edge of the compound, a fighter who had gotten inside the wire during the confusion and moved to a flanking position Sarah had not accounted for. The RP hit the HESCO barrier 2 meters to her left, and the blast wave hit her as a physical object. Not the heat, not the fragments, the wave itself, which picked her up from her position and drove her into the hard ground 12 feet away with enough force to knock the world sideways. She was conscious. The pain was immediate and total. Left shoulder, left side, left leg, where something had opened a cut she could feel but not see. She had hit the ground with her head, and the sound of the compound had taken on a distant underwater quality. She was on her back. The sky above FOB Kilo 7 was desert blue and cloudless and indifferent. She looked at it for approximately 2 seconds. Then she heard Delvain's voice. He was not calling for help. He was not calling for her. He was giving commands. His voice cutting through the noise of the compound with a clarity she recognized because she had heard it once before from a different man, in a different place, but with the same quality. The quality of someone who has accepted the situation completely and is now operating inside it rather than reacting to it. Garrett northwest corner, watch your left. Wendell eastern wall, do not move. Halverson, get me air support on the line right now. She got herself upright, used the barrier. Her left arm was not working correctly, but her right was functional, and her rifle was still in her right hand and her eyes were clearing. The compound was in controlled chaos, which is different from uncontrolled chaos in exactly one way: the people inside it know what they are doing. Delvain was moving along the southern wall toward the western breach, coordinating the 2 soldiers with him in the lateral pattern she had shown him. The pattern she had demonstrated casually without framing it as instruction. He had absorbed it, and he was using it, and he was using it correctly. Kowalski had retaken the left position at the western breach and was holding it with Halverson. The assault element inside the wire had been isolated. 3 fighters who had made it through before Delvain's response had sealed the gap were now in a section of the compound with no egress and 4 weapons oriented toward them. The compound was not clean, it was not won, but it was held. Sarah got to her feet. Her left arm hung at an angle that confirmed something structural had been disrupted, but she could move and she could see, and the rifle was in her right hand. She ran the situation the way her father had taught her. What is the decisive point? What is the single action that changes the geometry of the problem? The northern fighters were still active on the ridge above the compound. They had repositioned when the assault broke contact. She could hear them coordinating a radio call, urgent, with a cadence that told her they were setting up something that required stationary positioning and a clear line of sight. The mortar, not the tubes from the first night, a single tube redeployed to the high ground north of the FOB. From that position, with that elevation, they could drop rounds into the interior of the compound with complete accuracy. The HESCO barriers offered no protection from plunging fire. If that tube went into operation, the 16 functional soldiers of Delta Platoon had approximately 4 minutes. She looked at the high ground. 380 meters rising terrain, wind from the northwest at 14 knots, shifting gusts. Her left arm was not functional. She would have to fire from a supported position using her right side only, which eliminated her standard supported prone and required a modification. Her father had made her practice repeatedly in the rain when she was 16 years old, and furious about lying on wet Montana grass when she would rather have been anywhere else. She remembered every repetition. She went to the highest accessible point remaining in the compound. The eastern wall parapet, 3 feet of additional elevation above the main barrier line, exposed on 3 sides, accessible by a steel ladder with 4 rungs. She climbed it with 1 arm and both legs, and a focused economy of movement that left no room for consideration of what she was doing. She found the position. She found the support angle. She opened her father's notebook to the page she needed, the elevation conversion table he had built for this specific valley at this specific altitude with these specific prevailing winds. She had read it so many times she could have recited it. She read it again anyway. She acquired the target. 2 men setting up the mortar tube on the high ground, working fast, professional, with the efficiency of people who had done this before under pressure. They had the tube positioned and were working the bipod adjustment. 4 counts in. Her right hand was steady. Her left arm hung at her side like weight she was carrying rather than a part of her. The sun was behind her at this elevation. The wind was gusting to 19 knots from the northwest, a problem she had solved in the time it took to climb the ladder. Hold 7. The mortar crew completed their bipod adjustment. One of them reached for the first round. 8 out. She fired twice. The first round hit the assistant gunner. The second round hit the tube itself, or close enough that the crew's functional capacity ended. At the same moment, the first Apache announced itself, that rotor signature, every soldier in a contested position recognizes as the sound of the equation changing. The Apache came from the southwest at low altitude, and it did not ask questions. It swept the ridgeline north of the compound with a thoroughness that was final and complete. Behind it, 3 minutes later, a second Apache cleared the wadi to the east. The assault dissolved in approximately 7 minutes. The fighters who could move, moved. The fighters who could not were where they were. At 15:19 hours, FOB Kilo 7 was quiet. Sarah climbed down from the eastern parapet on one arm and both legs and sat on the ground at the base of the ladder, because standing was no longer something her body was prepared to negotiate without discussion. Her left shoulder had done something that would require more than tape. Her ears were ringing from the discharge at elevation without ear protection. Her hands were for the first time since the first night shaking. She let them shake. Kowalski found her there 4 minutes later. He looked at her shoulder. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He did not say anything for a moment, which was correct because there was nothing that needed to be said yet. He sat down beside her with the careful movement of a man managing his own damage, and they sat together on the ground at the base of the eastern wall while the compound moved around them with the organized energy that follows violence when the people inside it are still alive. After a while, Kowalski said, "The mortar crew." "Yes." "From the parapet." "Yes." 380 meters, one arm, gusting crosswind. Sarah looked at her shaking hands. "My father made me practice that position in the rain on wet grass for an entire autumn when I was 16. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precision of a man paying a specific debt, he was right too. The medic found her 10 minutes later and was professionally unhappy about her shoulder and her decision to climb a 4-rung ladder with it in its current condition. She accepted his assessment and his treatment and his commentary on her judgment without contradiction. He was right about all of it, and she had known he was right when she climbed the ladder and had made her decision anyway, which was not a justification, only a fact. Delvain came while the medic was working. He stood at a distance that respected the medical work and waited. When the medic stepped back, Delvain moved closer. He looked at her shoulder. He looked at her face. He was carrying something in his expression that she had not seen there before, not the careful recalibration of the past 6 days, not the determined focus of the firefight. Something older. Something that was finding its way out from behind the architecture of a young man who had arrived at this FOB 90 days ago with a great deal of certainty about how the world was organized. He had not prepared a speech. This was evident. He opened his mouth once and closed it. Then he said, "I was wrong about you." Sarah looked at him. "From the first day," he said, "I was wrong and I was loud about it, and you heard all of it, and you didn't." He stopped. "You didn't do anything with it except do your job better than any of us." He paused. "I don't know how to fix what I said. I'm not sure it fixes, but I wanted to say it directly." Sarah looked at him for a long moment with the steadiness she brought to things that required her full attention. "You held the southern position during the second wave," she said, "without being asked, in the right pattern, with the right timing." She paused. "That's what I needed from you today. You gave it." Delvain looked at the ground briefly, then back at her. He nodded once with the quality of a man accepting something he knows he doesn't fully deserve, but understands he needs to carry forward. He walked away. Kowalski, who had been present for all of this, without appearing to be looked at the space where Delvain had been standing. Then he looked at Sarah. A very small expression crossed his face, the look of a man who has seen this exact moment many times and finds, despite the familiarity, that it still means something. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Rourke spent 3 hours writing the contact report. Sarah knew this because the light was on in the TOC for 3 hours after the engagement ended, and he did not emerge for anything except a single trip to the water station, during which he moved with the focused absence of a man who is present in body while his attention is elsewhere working on a problem that requires words. She did not interrupt him. At 1900, Rourke came to the comms room. She was running her final frequency checks of the day, as she had done every day since her arrival, and she would continue to do tomorrow and the day after because the checks needed to be run, and she was the person responsible for running them, and nothing about the day's events changed that operational fact. Rourke stood in the doorway. He was holding his field notebook. He had the look of a man who has finished something that required a great deal of care and is now deciding whether to say anything about having finished it. "The contact report is filed," he said. "Yes, sir. I want to tell you what I wrote in it." She set down her pen. "Under the heading for Specialist Personnel Actions, I noted advanced marksmanship in support of defensive operations. I noted the FM7-8 pattern identification and the tactical recommendation that preceded the probe timing call. I noted the Southern Barrier Command actions." He paused. "I noted the mortar crew elimination from the Eastern Parapet." Another pause. "Everything in the report is accurate. Everything in the report is specifically framed within the scope of assigned duties for a Signal Corps specialist operating under combat conditions in support of her unit." Sarah looked at him. "There is no notation in the report that would draw attention from anyone above battalion level to the nature of your capabilities," Rourke said. "There is no language that would cause a review of your personnel file, a reassignment inquiry, or any administrative action that might place you in the visibility of officers operating above battalion level." He held her gaze. "You are, according to that report, a Signal Corps specialist who performed her assigned duties with distinction under sustained combat contact." She understood what he was doing. She understood the precision of it, the way a man who had spent 22 minutes on the phone with battalion the previous evening, during which he had received information about operational context he was not supposed to have, and had processed without complaint, could use the tools of institutional procedure to protect someone from the institutional machinery that had already tried to bury her once. Not a speech, not a ceremony, not a public declaration. A report filed in the correct format in the correct administrative channel that said exactly the right things in exactly the right way to accomplish exactly the right outcome. "Sir," she said. He waited. "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man accepting an acknowledgement he considers reasonable but not excessive. Then he closed his field notebook. "Reinforcements arrive in 9 hours," he said. "Get some rest." He walked out. She did not rest immediately. She sat in the comms room for an hour after the last frequency check was logged in the quiet of a compound that has finished its violence for the day and is moving through the routines that remind its inhabitants that tomorrow exists and will require the same attention as today. She listened to the sounds of it, the generators, the perimeter calls, the distant wind through the concertina wire. Then she went to her hooch. She sat on her cot and opened her father's notebook. Not to the terrain maps, not to the elevation tables, not to her own pages in the back. She opened it to the front and turned the pages slowly. Not reading, attending the elevation tables he had built over years of field work, refined across multiple deployments specific to terrain types. She now understood she had been prepared for in advance. The wind conversion charts with margin notes in pencil where he had revised his calculations based on empirical observation. The hand-drawn topographical sketches of valleys she had studied and memorized and walked through in her mind so many times that when she had arrived at FOB Kilo 7 and seen the actual valley through the cargo door of the helicopter, she had experienced the recognition of a place she had studied so long it had become real before she arrived. He had been preparing her for this, not for this deployment specifically, for this kind of moment, the moment when everything she had been given and everything she had promised and everything she had decided about who she wanted to be would converge in a place where the decision could not be deferred. He had not known the location. He had not known the timeline. He had known the nature. She turned to the last page he had filled. It was a terrain sketch, not Kunar but somewhere else, a valley she did not recognize with notations she had read many times without fully understanding their reference. The sketch was dated October 2009, 2 weeks before he died. The details were meticulous, the margin notes, specific, the work of a man operating at full capability in the last weeks of his life. In the lower right corner of the page below the sketch, in smaller handwriting than his usual note style, as though he had added it as an afterthought, or as something he had decided at the last moment needed to be included, were 2 lines. She had read them before. She had read them the night he gave her the notebook and had read them many times since, and each time she had understood them slightly differently, which she suspected was the correct way to understand something her father had written. She read them now. "If you're reading this here, you already know what to do. I taught you everything I could. The rest is yours." Sarah sat with that for a long time. Then she turned to her own pages at the back of the notebook, the pages she had been filling since she arrived. She read what she had written, the patrol notes, the terrain sketches, the mortar pattern analysis, the calculations she had run in the dark, and then she picked up her pen and wrote 3 new lines beneath everything else. The date, the grid, Kowalski's name as witness, That was enough for now. The rest would find its time. The Army ran on paper and procedure and records that outlasted the men who filed them, and she had learned from her father that the most durable weapon in any long fight was documentation. Harrow had closed one record. She was opening another, and this one had living witnesses. She closed the notebook. The night outside was cold and clear, and the stars were what they always were in this valley, enormous, indifferent, permanent. The wind moved through the wire. The generators hummed their long note. Somewhere on the northern perimeter, Kowalski was on watch, because Kowalski was always on watch, because some men do not stop watching the horizon simply because the shooting has ended for the day. 9 hours until reinforcements arrived. 29 hours until rotation. Then Kandahar, then Bagram, then the long flight home with a shoulder that needed surgery and a record that needed a different kind of operation, the kind conducted in daylight with witnesses in front of people who could not look away from it. But right now there was something else. She heard footsteps stop outside her door. Not Kowalski's, she knew his footfall by now. Not Rourke's, which were always purposeful and directional. These footsteps stopped with the hesitation of someone deciding whether to do the thing they came to do. Then she heard the footsteps move away. She waited 10 seconds. Then she got up and opened her door. The M24 was on the ground in front of her hooch, laid flat with the barrel pointing away from the door. It had been cleaned. Not field cleaned, properly cleaned, with the attention of someone who understood that the condition of a rifle is a form of respect for what it has done. The bolt was open. The chamber was visible. The stock had been wiped down, and the scope had been cleared, and the sling had been straightened, and the whole thing lay there in the dark outside her door, like something that had been returned to its proper place after a long time in the wrong hands. There was no note. There was no name. There was only the rifle. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. She looked at the compound around her, the barriers and the burn pits and the guard towers and the damaged western wall that the engineers would begin repairing at first light. She looked at the northern perimeter where a single figure stood in the dark watching the valley with the patience of someone who has been watching horizons for a very long time and intends to keep watching. She picked up the M24. She carried it inside. She set it beside her cot within reach where it belonged. She lay back down. She closed her eyes. The generators hummed. The wind moved. The stars were where they had always been. 9 hours. She would be there when they arrived. And when they landed in the compound filled with fresh soldiers and the noise of logistics and the bureaucratic machinery of relief and rotation, she would do what her father had done every morning of every deployment. She had heard him describe. She would stand up, check her weapon, and move forward into whatever the day required. Not because she had no fear, because she had something stronger than fear. She had his eyes. She had his notebook. She had his training and his patience and his way of reading terrain and his understanding that the most important distance in any engagement is not the distance between the shooter and the target. It is the distance between who you are and who you are capable of becoming. Thomas Cole had spent 18 years closing that distance for her. FOB Kilo 7 had closed the rest. She slept.